So, what do you do if you walk out into your doe pen and find a buck who was not supposed to be there? You mark your calendar for 145 days from today, and you start looking at udders about 4 to 4.5 months from today to see if anybody develops an udder. But you think, oh, I don't need to do that because nobody was in heat. I didn't see any breeding. So if that's what you're thinking, let me tell you a story or two or three, or I could be here all day telling you stories. So here's the first story, our first lesson in, oh, but she wasn't in heat. Many, many years ago, probably 20 years ago, the first doe I ever bought, her name was Star. And she had, the first year she had a buck that we kept. The next year she had another buck that we kept. And then a year or two later, my daughters came in the house and said, "Hey, Mom, we found mercury in the doe pen." And I was like, "Oh my goodness, is Star in heat?" And they're like, "Oh no, she was off grazing by herself." But he was following around these other two does. So I was like, okay, we'll mark the calendar and put, their names on there that they could possibly be due in 145 days. Well, 4 months later, my daughters came in the house one day and said, "Mom, I hate to tell you this, but Star is getting an udder." So as it turned out, Star was impregnated by her son, Mercury. And bonus tip for the day, never name a buck after anybody who could fly. And if you're up on your mythology, you know that Mercury was the winged god. He's the one that had the wings on his feet. And he had flown over the fence to get with the does when he realized his mom was in heat. And she was the only one he got pregnant. He must have bred her multiple times already, and she was no longer interested. And so then he was off looking for another girlfriend, even though nobody else was in heat. So that was our first lesson in not assuming that somebody did not get bred. And just 3 or 4 years ago, we had a situation with a buck. I walked out and I found a buck in the doe pen, and as it turned, so I went around, okay, I'm going to mark the calendar for 145 days. Is there anyone in particular we should be keeping our eyes on 4 months from now? So I walk around and I see that two does are dripping from their back end. There's white dripping from their back end. So I'm like, okay, those two were bred. So that was it, just those two. So I marked the calendar with their names, that these two goats might be due to kid in 145 days. And 4 months later, my husband came walking in and said, "Hey, Victoria is getting an udder," which really shocked me because Victoria was a goat that was never supposed to be bred again. She had actually wound up with a spinal cord injury a couple of years earlier. And so we were concerned. She walked funny, couldn't hold up her back end correctly. So we were concerned about her ability to carry a pregnancy and just had decided we're never going to breed her again. But unfortunately, she did get bred as well as another doe. So the funny thing about that is that the two does that did wind up being bred by Monarch were not the two that were dripping. So basically what had happened is he had been out there for long enough that he bred two does. They were no longer dripping and had bred two more does. But by that point, he was running on empty. His sperm count was so low that he didn't get the last two pregnant. So once again, we were not able, we didn't know who got bred and who was going to have babies in 5 months. And then the last story I want to tell you about, it was with our sheep. And that was it. My husband and I were on vacation one time. And when we came home, our son said, "Oh yeah, by the way, the ram got in with the retired ewes, but don't worry, nobody was in heat." And guess what happened 5 months later? Indeed, we had a 12-year-old ewe giving birth to a single lamb. So the moral of the story is, if there is ever a buck or a ram in with your females, we actually have a little saying now. There's really only one reason that a buck ever gets in with the females, and it's because somebody is in heat. So if you have had any unauthorized visits by your male goats or sheep to the females, you really should mark the calendar for 145 days from today. And I know some of you may be thinking, oh, but I have standard size goats, so I'm going to mark my calendar for 150 days or 155. I always recommend that you mark your calendar for 145 days because your goats could give birth at 145 days. I know when I got started, I would mark my calendar for 150 days, and I would get surprised sometimes at 145, 146, 147, because that day on the calendar had not come up yet. So I always do 145 days. And even when I had La Manchas, I would mark my calendar for 145 days because I don't know if the La Manchas were talking to the Nigerians and the Nigerians convinced them that they were supposed to give birth before 150 days, but they always did. So, and that is perfectly acceptable. For standard size goats, the window is a little bigger. It's 145 to 155 days, where for Nigerians, it is 145 to 150 days. And I think I can count on one hand, out of 775 kids we've had, I think I could count on one hand the number of goats that went beyond 150 days. So it's very unusual for them to do that. So like I said, got any unauthorized breedings, mark your calendar for 145 days from today. Start looking for udders in about 4 to 4.5 months so that you don't walk out there one day and get surprised by baby goats, especially if 5 months from the time you see that, it's the dead of winter. So for us in Illinois, we're really, really serious about making sure that we don't get any surprise babies in the middle of February or even March, because that could end very tragically. They could quickly freeze to death in our freezing and even sub-zero temperatures that we have sometimes in the middle of winter. If you've got any questions, post in the comment section below. Bye for now.